Sounds good.
All right, well, hello and welcome to the second conversation in our Corner Booth series, where we're discussing intersectional issues around public policy. And before we begin and introduce our guest, I just wanted to remind everybody of a few norms that we are requesting that in the initial part of our conversation, that if you have any questions, perhaps you consider dropping them in the chat or holding them till the end, and we will have time for a robust Q&A at the end of the conversation with Dr. Jenkins. I'm also going to drop a website in the chat for anybody who wants to know more about the mission of the organization that Dr. Jenkins works with. Please feel free to check that out during our conversation. Oh, and I forgot to introduce us. My name is Allison Levecki, and my co-host is...
Hi, I'm Whitney Holt.
And we are part of a student group at the Hobby School of Public Affairs, and we are sponsored by Professor Angster, and we just want to thank him for his support and allowing us to pursue these conversations. So with that, Whitney, you can introduce our guest.
Yes, we're so excited to have Dr. Jenkins. She is the Executive Director for Houstonians for Greater Public Schools. She began her professional career as a bilingual fourth grade teacher in Alief ISD, recognizing that many of the challenges that she and her students faced on a daily basis stemmed from policy issues at the national, state, and local levels. She decided to pursue a master's degree and PhD in political science at the University of Houston, go Cougs, and focused her research on education policy and school governance. Dr. Jenkins has worked as a new teacher advisor, curriculum specialist, and school director with Teach for America, and she served as the manager of community-based initiatives with Advantage Testing of Houston. She was also a founding member of the regional strategy team for the Organizing Network for Education, ONE Houston, and a 2016 candidate for the Texas State Board of Education. In addition to leading the Houston GPS team, Dr. Jenkins is an adjunct instructor at Rice University. A Pennsylvania native, Jasmine has been living and working in Houston since 2006, and she is passionate about expanding educational opportunities for all children. And we are so incredibly lucky to have her here today. So welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to start off our questions. First one is, what are the priorities for public school students in underserved communities? What programs or policies have been successful thus far, in your opinion, and what opportunities still remain?
That's a great question. First, very, very broadly, the priority for underserved students in underserved communities is one of these days we are going to have to figure out how to educate children in poverty. I think the broader problem is there are too many children who live in poverty, and every policy solution that we get to seems to just sort of illustrate that to us in one way or another. Fundamentally, our systemic racism has caused poverty to be concentrated in Black and Latina communities more often. And so there's definitely a racial component to that. But in terms of a policy solution, we get to small pieces at the margins. And every time we say, well, maybe it's standardized assessments, maybe it's standardized or setting educational standards, maybe it's bringing new people into the career of teaching, maybe it's funding. Every time we sort of get at that, we might address a few issues at the margins. But ultimately, we don't have a broad systemic way of addressing how do we educate children in poverty, because that's where we find our kids. And honestly, and this might get into some of the questions that you have later, I think that too often what happens in the public education space is when we say, well, we aren't good at educating kids in poverty, folks want to shift focus over to, well, let's address the fact that kids are in poverty, when that's not what the public education system was set up to do to begin with. And so we drift away and say, well, we really don't like standardized testing, or we really don't like school choice because it leaves kids in poverty. Well, the truth is we still have to educate them, right? We still have to make sure that they know how to read. We still have to prepare them for a future of their choosing, whether it be in the trades or in academia. We still have to be able to do that, and we have not figured out how to do that yet. And so I think that's the fundamental issue, is we still haven't figured out a great way of how to truly educate kids where we find them. And programs that have been successful, and I think that there are places that are doing it right at the margins, are places where schools are more autonomous. And I had a ton of background in quantitative research methods at the University of Houston, and I'm sure you all are familiar with how much emphasis we put on data, which is wonderful, right? And what do we find? Broadly, like if we're just looking at sweeping trends over the last 30 years, 30, 40, 50 years, we really haven't been able to make major changes in the achievement gap broadly. But on the margins, things like autonomous school leaders, community-focused education that really thins out what happens at the bureaucratic level, does improve outcomes for kids who live in poverty if you have the right school leader. And so I think efforts that emphasize school leadership, autonomy for really high quality school leaders, parents being able to have choice, have been able to improve things for some kids. Unfortunately, for other kids, it still leaves pockets of poverty and kids who continue to be underserved. But on the margins, I think that there are things that work for kids, but broadly, until we fix this bigger system of how do we educate kids in poverty, we're going to continue to sort of just chip away at a giant iceberg.
Thank you. That was definitely important to think about. I think that's the whole crux of what our goal is in this series of interviews, is helping people to understand that there's no one policy issue that stands alone, right?
Right.
So we can't address the gaps in education without addressing gaps in other areas. So another question for you. Neighborhood school zoning can often exacerbate the historic effects of redlining, which is something we talked about in our course this year. What policies would you support that both preserve the benefits of community, but also help to undo the cycle of perpetual poverty driven by under-resourced and underperforming schools?
Yeah, this does get at sort of what I was talking about before, and will get at my future question of, like, you know, the neighborhood zoning for schools is it's both a benefit for some people because of the sense of community, but it has only served to exacerbate the already existing disparities in resources and opportunities. So first of all, Houston ISD, which is where I spend the bulk of my time and work, is a school district of choice. So people are not as confined to their specific neighborhoods. And we find that parents who know how to navigate the system readily access choice of all kinds, whether it be to send their child to a private school, to send their child to a public charter school, to send their child to a magnet school or a different traditional public school within the ISD. So I think that increased choices improve the opportunities for parents and families, even at all income levels. There's a question about social capital beyond that, meaning you might have parents who don't necessarily have a ton of money, but they know how to navigate the magnet system. They know when to fill out the forms. They know that there's a charter school that's a great option for, you know, for their child. And so you do start to, like I said, get at some people at the margins. But then what do you do for kids who might be newcomers to the US, who live with aunts or uncles or other distant relatives and not necessarily their parents, who might be raising younger siblings on their own? What do you do for kids like that? And I don't think the answer there is, well, shut down options or choices. So I do think neighborhood school zoning has really exacerbated the problem, particularly as we see issues like gentrification coming up. And again, what the temptation, I think, is for folks who work in public education, the temptation is to then say, well, the problem is gentrification, let's focus on that. And we still haven't gotten to this issue of how do we educate the kids that we have and the kids that we have now. If people want to focus on disparities in access to real estate, if people want to focus on the effects, the continuing effects of redlining, if people want to focus on gentrification, that's all wonderful, but it still leaves these kids not really getting the resources they need, and limiting the choices and options that are available to parents is just not the answer.
Thank you for that. What you're saying is really inspiring to me, because we talk about the Ouroboros, right? The snake eating its tail of poverty and education, or educational opportunity, and where you're coming in economically. And hearing you say, like, at some point you just jump in and accept the reality, instead of saying, like, how do we figure out how to make sure that kids aren't living in poverty? Yes, that's true, but also, like, we don't wait for them to stop being in poverty before we start figuring out how to educate them.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for everything you're saying. It's really inspiring. Okay, so our next question, many students in our policy cohort are currently working in local government and are aware of the fine line between gentrification and necessary revitalization for low-income and underserved communities. What do we need to be cognizant of in regards to public schools and public school children in these neighborhood revitalization efforts?
And one of these things is the superintendent, the new HISD superintendent, Millard House, just talked about access to programs at traditionally underserved schools being more equitable in the distribution of programs. And I think that that's an important conversation to have, because honestly, for most of the last 20 years, when we talk about gentrification, either we talk about property taxes getting so high or rents getting so high that we squeeze out pockets of people who've traditionally lived there for years and years and years, most of the 20th century into the beginning of the 21st century. We squeeze them out. The schools that are already there, sort of lose enrollment and fall into disrepair, and we decide to close them, and just sort of push those communities out completely. Or, and this we've seen a little bit more over the last 10 to 15 years, the new families that move in, we rely on those families to reignite or revitalize the traditional public schools that are in the neighborhoods and sort of reclaim them with these sort of learn local movements. We've seen that in several places in the Houston Heights, for example, where gentrification has come, and then what's followed is people deciding that they want to send their kids to those schools and demanding access to those schools through improved resources, sometimes bringing the resources themselves. And while I think that in theory, that's a good feeling, it keeps the school from being shut down, what ultimately results is parents and families who have been there for years, again, are either squeezed out because of rents and the actual cost of living there, or start to feel excluded from what has always been their own school in that process. And so I think as we are thinking about revitalization, we see in housing a lot more of these community development funds, spaces, neighborhoods, projects set aside to make sure that people can remain in their neighborhoods, can remain in their homes, which is great. We need to think about that in terms of the schools as well. As a community begins to develop, are we also still saying, the people who are moving here are also going to need a local school? Can we as a community decide to continue to invest resources in the school that's already there? Can we find partnership programs that can, reignite interest in a school? An example of that might be the Baylor College of Medicine at Ryan Middle School in 3rd Ward. Ryan Middle School was it was a dying school. It's difficult to say something like that because there were teachers there were children there, but at its very bottom when it had been in improvement required status for years on end. It had fewer than 300 students in a middle school in the fourth largest city in America. That's tiny for a traditional neighborhood school. And rather than closing it down, the district decided to partner with Baylor College of Medicine and really revitalize. There was a lot of controversy about whether or not they reserved enough seats, or they didn't reserve any seats, about reserving seats for people who live in the neighborhood, which I think would have been a much better approach to that, rather than making it an open enrollment magnet school. But programs like that, the idea of, let's try to see if we can partner with entities, let's try to make this an attractive destination for different people and the people who are moving in here, is a better way of ensuring that schools don't just shrivel up and die.
Thank you. That's a really interesting example that I didn't know about. Okay, so nearly 40% of teachers in the Houston region have 5 or fewer years of experience. So even with salaries that are higher than the state average. So what can Houston school districts do to incentivize the retention of experienced teachers?
That's a great question. Two things. First, two things in addressing this question. The first thing I will say is school leadership matters. Now, Houston ISD specifically really lags in terms of teacher pay. So there are a lot of options. There's 17 ISDs that somehow touch or are fully encompassed in Harris County, right? So, and none of them have a residency requirement like we see in some of the other states in the country. So Houston ISD specifically does need to compete with these other districts in how much they pay. Now, region-wide, teacher pay is actually pretty solid compared to the rest of the state and compared to the rest of the country. Even still, as you mentioned, we see, a lot of teacher turnover, a lot of people leaving the profession, right? So if it's not just money, what else is there? And I have yet to, I'm a former teacher, I taught 4th grade. I've yet to encounter a K-12 teacher who would not give strong consideration to staying in a place where they felt appreciated, respected as a professional, and a part of a team that's moving toward a stated goal. And so that comes from school leadership. It really does. And so it's like you encounter a manager, a boss, a coach, the people who are around you. If you are feeling like you're in an environment that's really positive and moving you on the right track professionally, I think that people are definitely going to be more inclined to stay in that school, stay in that profession. There's something to be said more broadly about how we treat the teaching profession for K through 12 teachers as a country, as a society here. But in Houston specifically, I think that we could at least get at a piece of that by really focusing on strong, stable school leadership. But then the other side of this question that I think is worth addressing is that after about 15 years in the classroom, you start to get diminishing returns in terms of like teacher effectiveness. And so that time between 5 and 15 years is really sort of the sweet spot. So I would argue, I'm not even that interested in incentivizing people to stay in teaching their entire lives, right? Like, how do we get these 20-year veterans to stay in the classroom? I'm saying, like, how do we make sure that people feel well-developed, well-equipped, very much motivated to engage in this work for a significant amount of time and are super productive during that time, right? So I don't think the answer is necessarily like, how do we make sure that people stay in teaching forever, as much as how do we make sure that people love and are compelled to do the work of teaching for as long as they're productive, as long as they love and are compelled by it.
That is exactly how I would have answered that. As a former instructional coach, I've often preferred working with younger teachers than the veterans who had been there for a very long time, and often found a massive difference in their effectiveness in the classroom, right. Just on a individual anecdotal level. So yeah, that's definitely an important point to consider. Winnie, are you up next or is it me?
I I think question 5 was going to be dealer's choice. So do you want to ask or do you want me to ask?
You can
Well,
ask
go
that.
ahead. I will ask the question that it most appeals to me. So vouchers are often seen as efficient, if not equitable, ways of offering education. Are there any aspects of a voucher system that you think we could reform in a way so that we keep the positive impact while mitigating the negative impacts that come with them?
That's a great question. In as much as I feel like we face the same issue with vouchers, which is that we get at some folks who could benefit from them, but still leave these larger, usually pockets of poverty. I don't know that the voucher system as it exists in different states and in different forms has been able to truly mitigate the broader issue. I haven't done a ton of research into it simply because a lot of folks already recognize the problematic aspects of the fact that, like, in a lot of urban settings, the amount of money that parents get as a result of vouchers is not enough to actually put their child in a better educational setting than they would be otherwise if they just went to their traditional neighborhood school. And the folks that it does help, it's sort of like helping them at the margins, right? These weren't the people who were already struggling the most. And so my initial answer is no, I don't know that in the short term, there's a way for vouchers to actually fix the system. I'm sort of responding to that with open hands, but I think that there are better solutions that we could get to really figure out how to educate kids in poverty before actually reforming that system.
Thank you. Nobody on this call is confused that I am not a proponent of vouchers, but I'm always trying to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I was curious if you had an insight that maybe I was missing.
That's fair.
Okay, so it seems like a good time to open up to Q&A, and Miriam has typed a question into the chat. Since she's driving, I'll read it for her, but Miriam, feel free to chime in if you want to add more context. What do we know about the effectiveness of second career teachers?
So I know very little. I can talk about teachers who come into the profession via alternative certification, some of whom are second career, some of whom just went to college but did not go through a traditional school of education. They're not overall not very long lasting alternative certification teachers, but in urban settings, teachers who come in through alternative certification, they tend to be about as effective as teachers who come in through traditional schools of ed, but that doesn't necessarily just speak to second career ones. I feel like there's a hand up.
Yeah, that's Dr. Inkster. He's up next.
He'll be next.
Okay.
Professor Inkster, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, here I come. Wait, there I am. Okay. Well, thank you. That was really that was a great interview. I learned a lot from that, and I have a number of different questions, but let me just focus on these ones. So you said one of the things that we know about how to educate children in poverty is that school autonomy is important, and then I think you said that it's the autonomy of good leadership within schools that is really important. And so I really like this idea. So one question I have is, can you tell me where I can go and find some of this research that says that, or maybe this is something that I'll email you later or something. But I would really that's that fits with what I think theoretically to be right, and so I want to have that empirical background. But I'd also like to hear you just kind of unwind that a little bit more of so when you say schools that are taught, like, you give principle, because you also said it's got to be a good principle. So you give principals of schools more control over things like hiring, or what kind of autonomy are you talking about with that? And like, what is it and what do they do? What makes a, you know, with their autonomy that helps in schools?
Yeah, so I have a little bit of the empirical evidence that I actually used in my own dissertation research, which is now 7 or 8 years old. So there's much more recent stuff as well, which is that school principals who do have control over things like hiring, even curriculum choices, right? So these are the types of things that we find in a decentralized system or in an independent school system. So like public charters. If we're just looking at public schools, do get better results for low-income kids in terms of their actual assessment scores, and then graduation rates, and then college matriculation rates. And that's even controlling for multiple factors for parents. What starts to get murky, however, is this sort of controlling for social capital, which is something that a lot of folks in education have not really been able to grasp, right? Like there are parents who might be poor or even uneducated, but who for whatever reason are better able to navigate a system, better able to pick a certain school for their child. So the constant argument is the results in these independent schools with these leaders who are better able to pick to make choices for their own school communities is a result of the kids that they're getting, and not necessarily a result of the independence of the leader. Again, with principals, there is sort of like a diminishing return on the length of their tenure. But we know that a turnover every 2 years is bad, right? But do we need a principal to be there for 20 years? Maybe not. And so when we talk about school autonomy, to answer the one piece, is it, do they get autonomy in who they hire? Yes, in terms of, not just in terms of like the actual people they fill, but the positions that they're actually looking to fill, right? Maybe I don't want a librarian, maybe I want a tech specialist or a reading interventionist, right? So being able to have those choices. In addition, so they also get some of their own budgeting authority, and they're able to make some curriculum choices as well in terms of that type of autonomy. So there is a little bit of thought there. I will say again, the variables that we use for controls are a little bit murky, because ultimately in systems of choice, like we see in HISD, which does have pretty autonomous principals compared to a lot of other school districts in Texas even, or when we look at the public charter sector, there's always the question of, well, it's an opt-in system for the parents, so have you really been able to control for everything in terms of the children that they're educating, that are coming in the door?
Can I ask a question, not as host, but as participant? So since you have a background in political science, you can sidestep this if you want, but I feel like you will be able to answer this. How do you think that we operationalize social capital? Like, how do we measure that when we're trying to do these studies? Because that's one of those like nebulous terms that like seems kind of murky, but like also seems to be a missing piece at this point.
That's a great question. So I have used education, income, and voting as a proxy, like a mix of those three at different levels. I've seen people also do sort of like participation in one of the following civic type environments: church, neighborhood association. There might have been a couple others. That's the $1 million question, as it were. Very recently, I saw, I don't think it was a formal study. It might have just been an article or an op-ed where, there was research done around the social mobility of children born into households with parents who were married from birth to 18 versus not. And they found that, that was the biggest indicator when they controlled for some of these other variables, right? So there's a question about, home stability or married parents or a 2-parent household. There's just a lot of stuff that goes into that. So my short answer is, I don't know either. How do we operationalize social capital? But those are some of the things that I've seen thrown around.
Those are all really interesting to think about. Thank you. Trevor?
Sure, thank you. And I learned about this new concept last night, actually, in class, in our philosophy class, about accessible instructional materials. And you talked about how we need to learn to teach kids in poverty and not wait, as a goalpost for, we'll teach them when they get out of poverty. What role does accessible instructional materials play in that? And I kind of learned it in the context of, well, like for accommodations, one of my students needs a take-home test, so I give a take-home test to everyone because I'm not going to make special accommodation, and then the people that don't speak up, I'll just give it to everyone. That's the example I learned it in.
That's a really good one. First of all, the public school system broadly is not at all well equipped to provide equitable instruction to children as they need it. And that gets to the broader issue of we still don't know how to educate kids in poverty, because as a system, it's very, it's intentionally egalitarian by design, but only as a method, like historically, as a method of creating, of assimilating immigrants and making sure that that kids will be good workers, right? That's how the system was created from the beginning. But as we've evolved, we've learned the language of things like accessible materials, equity. People love throwing around equity these days as a term. And every time we start talking about equity, we fall back into the cycle of equality, right? So it's like, oh, this student needs a take-home test, so I have to have a take-home test for everyone. Or, oh, this again happens a lot in HISD. We need a position of a person who's solely dedicated to providing social services to children, non-academic services to children, or providing access, right? Basically serving as a middleman between the social services that are available and families who need them, and school is the best place to provide that. I don't disagree with that, right? But then HISD says, well, we'll call it a wraparound specialist and we'll make sure that every single school has one. And it's like, is that equity? Because I would be willing to bet that some schools in the district probably only need a part-time person to do that. They probably have at least a few kids who need access to social services. And some schools in HISD need 4. So they say, oh, we have a wraparound specialist in every school. We're equitable now. And it's like, actually, no, you're talking about equality, right? So we keep getting back to this, let's give everybody the same. And that's, it's just not effective.
Yeah, perfect. That was a really good answer. I appreciate it. And that was a topic I learned last night. And I was like, that's interesting. I'd never heard of that kind of concept used in the, in a way in education. If I can ask a second question, when you kind of touched on how you were a teacher for several years and then you switched over to advocacy work, I think it's really admirable. A lot of people who don't just quit the profession totally and they switch over to, trying to reform the system that they were once a part of. What kind of led you to go into more advocacy work to reform the school system after you were a teacher? What led you to leave teaching?
That's a great question. So when I started with Teach for America, which honestly, and I can't say now because this was 2006, right? So I'm not sure if the model has changed. But at the time, Teach for America was very much billed as, you're smart, you're driven, can we please just get you to teach for 2 years and then you can go do the rest of your life and you will have had this really good experience and hopefully, contribute to these issues later on. And I think I very much fell into that mold. I will say that my teaching experience then shaped what I chose to do afterwards. I had always planned to go back to school. I had always planned to be in policy somehow. the focus on education policy came specifically from having taught. I tell this to absolutely everyone who asks. I really wish I had stayed in teaching just a little bit longer. As we just discussed, like, you really don't get okay until 5 years. And then you need another 10 years to be good, and then you should go, right? So I wish I had stayed in the classroom longer. I do think that it has informed the work that I do now, and sort of made me better in terms of the policy interest. But the policy interest has been there since childhood for me. Education policy was a result of really having been on the front lines and recognizing, like, as hard as I tried, I was probably not as equipped as I needed to be to really get to the kids who needed it most. And I don't think any teacher is, even the really good ones who are there for 7, 10, 15 years.
Thank you for sharing that.
Hey.
I'm going to ask another. Oh, go ahead, Allison.
Yeah.
I feel like I've asked a lot of questions. I'm just hanging on her every word. So go ahead.
No, I know. I was just going to ask if anybody else had any, and then I have like one of the ones we planned is a really good like wrap up question. So if you want to ask yours first, Whitney, and then we can. So whenever you're ready, or
Yes,
if anybody else,
it might steal some of the thunder from your question. So I'm really sorry, but. So you gave the example of the wraparound specialist and like equity across the district, how you can fall into the equity versus equality trap when you do stuff like that across the district. And I'm curious, because like from the way you're talking about, hey, instead of like, while we are also trying to figure out how to get kids out of poverty, let's figure out how we meet them where they're at to give them a high quality education. What are the like campus or district specific policies that you have found to be most effective to meet that goal of like meeting kids where they're at to try to educate them?
That's a really good one. I think, first of all, teacher pipelines and cohorts. So, I mean, obviously I'm an alum of Teach for America, but the way that it has been used in some places, it's not effective in the same way everywhere. But at different points, especially with, a teacher cohort style teacher fellowship program like Teach for America, the way that it's been used, it's got a long history here in Houston. And so they've had different iterations at different times, different numbers of people that they bring in, et cetera. So in the past, there have been periods of time, 3 to 5 years, where they'll say, listen, we're going to take this cohort of new teachers and we're actually going to put them all in, several different places. We're going to have schools with a large concentration of them so that they have a community to rely on. Or they have, a consistent school leader who already knows who they are, and they can really grow in a professional community in that way. And that's been actually really successful in producing strong school leaders out of those cohorts and people who stay longer in the profession. So like, that's one way. Another thing that HIC is doing right now is a cohort style program called Teach Forward. I don't know if you guys, have you heard of Teach Forward? It's a partnership between the University of Houston and Houston ISD, where one of the magnet schools does have a like sort of teacher track for high schoolers who might be interested in becoming teachers. And so they start getting exposed to that even in high school. And then if they are selected, they get to be in a cohort of students. They started with 50 who get automatic admission into the University of Houston, into their school of education, and their school is paid for. And that has been an incredibly effective program in not only producing homegrown teachers, but also college retention. So like the biggest drop off in retention once kids enroll in college is between freshman and sophomore year, right? So there's just this giant drop off in low income kids who actually go to college, they matriculate, and then they show, first day, whether or not the butt is in the seat sophomore year is a big indicator of whether or not they're actually going to finish. And so they've seen huge success in those kids getting into and then getting through college. And then we have a cohort of homegrown teachers to come into schools. I have not yet seen the results, because that program is still fairly new. I think it's only 5 years old. So we're really just finishing up the first or second year of their very first cohort. The results of the teachers who have, who are now teachers, former HISD alum, U of H alum, who are now teachers. But I have a sneaking suspicion that, it's incredibly strong, especially since, they are, already equipped to be teachers in an environment where they grew up.
Awesome. I love that exists. I just had to say that. That's so cool.
Is that the same as the program that looks to like recruit students that are at the top of their class? Is that what you're talking about from HISD? Because I heard there was a program like that as well to try to get more STEM teachers, I guess.
I have not heard about the STEM piece. I don't think there's a STEM component in this one. I do know that there is a, sort of like an SAT requirement and GPA requirement, but I'm not familiar with any sort of a STEM focus.
Okay. It might not have been, or maybe it's not around anymore. My husband's dissertation was on like the opportunity cost of becoming a teacher. And so he was looking at that program as a way to like lure kids away from engineering and things because they just want to go to a job where they're going to make a lot more money.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So I think there was something like that at the time, but I'm not going to claim any real knowledge. Trevor, did you have a question?
Yes, it actually sparked my memory. Do you have time for another question? Do we have time?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I used to work for an organization called I Educate USA in Houston. So I worked within KIP. I don't know if you're familiar with the organization, but we did like tutoring inside of charter schools in Houston. What role and impact do you think those organizations have? And is it a meaningful impact in the Houston school system?
I think it's, okay, meaningful is a very loaded term, right? Like, I think it's incredibly meaningful for those who have access to it and can engage with it in a really like long-lasting way. So a lot of, goodness knows, there's tons of like mentoring programs, tutoring programs. One-on-one tutoring is incredibly effective, provided that we can, consistently get kids access to it. The problem is on a broad scale, it tends to just be very sort of school by school. And if we're talking about broadly, like it would be more effective to have 100 principals who are just like the principal at the KIP school that you were actually able to partner with, who are ensuring that those resources get to the kids in their school as well.
All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap up so that we can respect your time. Thank you so much for all of this. This conversation has been so illuminating and inspiring, and I just love it. For everybody, you can find Houston GPS on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Dr. Jenkins, did you want to do your candidate plugs?
Oh, yes, please. So there's a runoff in the HISD school board elections. Please vote, vote, vote. If you live in HISD District 1, we are supporting Jeanette Garza Lindner. She is opposing the current incumbent. I know that's always touchy. It's like there's an elected official, everybody knows them, but I think Jeanette will be a much more effective steward of HISD's resources. The District 1 is the northern part, the northwestern part of the city, the Heights, Garden Oaks. District 5, that's Westview, Rice Village, Bel Air, Meyerland, Sue Dygard we are supporting, and District 6, which is pretty much outside of the loop, headed west, just I-10 all the way to Katy. We are supporting Holly Flynn Villaseca.
Thank you for that. And then, sorry, can you say one more time what the last day to vote is?
December 11th is
December
voting
11th.
day, and early voting is November 29th through December 7th.
Perfect. All right.
It was wonderful to chat with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. For everybody, thank you also to Dr. Inkster and the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership for sponsoring this. A recording of this event can be found on the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center page of the UH website. And our events will resume after the new year, and Trevor will be joining us as a host, start coming our January event. So we're very excited. All right, and this has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.